I serve as the vibe mistress, a title that kind of was bestowed upon me that I have embraced, of Soul Sanctuary, which is a local nonprofit. And our mission statement is the preservation and proliferation of positive urban culture. So we do that weekly through a music podcast, but we also look for opportunities to engage people in conversation and to get people intermingling with one another around issues of culture, and particularly history, because as we were having a casual conversation earlier this evening about the responsibility that we all have to pass down the knowledge that we have to other people, whether it's formally or casually, but to make sure that intergenerationally, interethnically, interfaith, whatever the boundaries are that we sometimes surround ourselves with, that we have a responsibility to reach beyond those categories or boundaries and make sure that we are sharing as much of what we know and what we love, those things we are passionate about, with other people. And so Soul Sanctuary seeks to do that by convening people around those things we already love. One of my favorite films is High Fidelity, starring John Cusack. And he says that in relationships, it's not about really how you feel about each other, it's about what you collectively like. And so, you know, if you and someone else have the same kind of playlist, then maybe there's an opportunity to build off of that mutual love that you have for the music and turn it into something else. And in my walk here in Philadelphia, I'm not a native Philadelphian, I'm originally from DC. Coming to Philadelphia and in the various capacities that I have had the pleasure of working in, whether it's vocalist or spoken word artist or talk show host, I have had the chance of encountering some incredible people. And one of the things that I brought tonight that is now signed, which I'm delighted by, is a gift that I was given back when I was working at an ad agency as one of my first jobs after graduating from Penn. And this beautiful book, The Family of Black America, as you can see, was edited, compiled, produced by our guest for tonight's Q&A. And it's just amazing how things that mean something to you can often lead to a personal interaction or encounter. And I have had a chance of getting to meet this wonderful Willis family because of the work that I do, my day job, as I like to call it, at WURD here in Philadelphia. And it's the kind of tentacles of how families have been entrenched or rooted here in Philadelphia, and the way that their presence is felt through generations, as Ms. Ruth is sitting here, the matriarch of this family is right here in the front row tonight. It means something, and it's something that I deeply connect with because of my family's roots in DC and how it becomes so impactful to be in a space for generations and to see how things evolve through the various lenses of the generations of that family. So I'm thankful that I got a chance to meet Ms. Ruth as an ardent listener to WURD and then understand all of the different folks that are in her family. Just last Thursday when we were at the Bloxon collection, we were in the domain of her daughter Leslie, and now tonight we have an opportunity to be in conversation with Dr. Deb Willis. So thank you. Thank you for being here and for making Slought and this exhibit a kind of pit stop on your very busy summer schedule.
Yeah, summer schedule. Right. Thank you.
And you know, when I extended the invitation, and even as you were coming in tonight, with us being surrounded by the work of my great uncle, I did not know that you knew him. So one of the first things that I'd love to know, photographer to photographer, was how you became familiar with him and his work.
I met him years ago in the early 80s. I was working at the Schomburg Center, and I was working closely with Moneta Sleet Jr., who worked for Ebony Jet magazine as well, and published a number of images. We had the greatest time meeting at different exhibitions. And then when I moved to DC, I was working at the Smithsonian when we were developing the African American Museum on the Mall, and we had a number of exhibitions. And he says, you know, Debbie, I really want you to start looking at my work and have an idea and exchange. So we just talked about his work a lot. And so it was really, really a wonderful man. He was a joy.
Yeah.
He really loved photography. He loved his work. He loved all of the other photographers that we knew together, but he also understood his subjects.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, you know, I love that as an anecdotal story because, again, you know, this idea of how people's reputations precede them. He was always Uncle Maurice to me. It wasn't, you know, predicated on the work that he did or, you know, the titles behind his name, you know, what publication he was working for. It was about an intimacy with the subject matter and a real love for that. And clearly from the very beginning. That is the same thing that I felt in the way that you approach photography and the commitment that you have to showing Black culture, Black people with a level of dignity that we struggle to get in our everyday lives. And it's more important to me, and one of the reasons why I was so humbled and thankful that you were able to participate in this conversation is because it's in what some people might consider to be mundane, where very often you choose to show the greatest beauty. Some of the things we take for granted. And in the recent exhibit that you had at the African American Museum, some of that surrounded beauty shops. I would love for you to kind of talk about your history in being in those spaces and why you chose to photograph that. Okay.
So I was in an exhibition at the African American Museum in Philadelphia. It was titled In Pursuit of Beauty, In Search of Beauty. I grew up in a beauty shop. My mom went to Apex Beauty School down on South Street in the 50s. And my life was surrounded by women and women who understood that they were workers, they were caregivers, they took care of people. So I grew up listening to stories. I used to love watching the women walk into my mother's shop, just talking about their day. Their days were full of, you know, conflict and joy, but they loved coming to my mom's place. Listening to them, I learned about relationships, I learned about politics, learned how to deal with people in terms of how they were negotiating family members, but also that I found that the experience of growing up in a beauty shop, that you explore the idea of what it means to be a collective voice. You know, they listen to, I used to sit on the floor and listen to them, but also look at Life magazine and look at the photographs and Ebony magazine. That's when I first was introduced to Gordon Parks' photographs, by looking at the magazines. And the same with Ebony magazine with Monita Sleet. Yeah. So I had the experience of looking through photographic magazines, listening to stories of women who, one woman was a headmistress for I can't remember, she lived on Cumberland Street. She's a headmistress for a school. She used to take care of women. She was head of the women's dorms in school. And she would, every time she was back, she visited Philadelphia, she would come to Mom and listen and get her hair styled. And then some of them had their blue hair, you know, hairstyles. But the important aspect for me was to learn how communities were built, that they were getting dressed for going out at night, but they were also getting ready for church in the morning. And they were women who were all empowered. They were not subjugated in any way. They didn't feel that they were inferior. And so it was surprising for me when I entered school that there were a range of experiences about women, specifically about Black women, that they were always demeaned in the way that they were depicted and described in what I read, because I didn't know the women. I didn't know who the people that they were talking about. I only knew women who were empowered. And even if they worked as domestic workers, that was their day job or Tuesday job or Thursday job. But they were empowered about how they felt about each other. We also, my family they were interested in boxing. They were interested in card games and, you know, sports and the whole range. Yeah. So listening to, growing up in that area, in that environment, we also met photographer Jack Franklin, who lived down the street from us. And so the social politics of the community was also a part of the experience of photography.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, that I think is incredibly important, because one of the things that to me is very integral about Uncle Maurice's story is that there were specific occasions where he wanted to be trained. He wanted to work in official capacities, but was denied because he was a little black man in you know, a very demanding government-driven town and career, and most people were just like, you know, that's something for you to do as a hobby. This is not a career path for you. And I have heard you speak about not being valued, even though you chose to formally study photography, and some of the feedback that you were given. And so for the benefit of people who may not have heard that part of your story, I would love for you to share that and understand the challenge that you have faced in trying to express yourself through this very creative medium.
Right. When my father was an amateur photographer, really serious about photography, and he had a rollie, and he photographed us as a family often. He also had a grocery store. They had made the best hoagies in North Philadelphia, so people would always come to our place and get hoagies. But he was also a police officer here in the city, and so image was always a central part of my life, because of my father he always talked about appearances, looking, dress, everything. And it's not necessarily dress for respectability, but dress in terms of identity. Yeah. How do you see yourself? And that was the most important thing for me. And he also had a cousin who had a photographic studio nearby, and we sat in his studio. My family members sat in his studio, and I was fascinated with it. Fascinated when I was young, because I picked up The Sweet Flypaper of Life, which was a book by Langston Hughes and Roy DeCarava, and having to look at that story, and I thought as a visual storytelling moment, I wanted to become a photographer. Yeah. And I decided to study photography, and no one wanted to encourage me to do it, because you had to have a full-time job and, you know, and get that job, right? Go to school, get a job. And so I went to Pierce Junior College, and across the street was Philadelphia College of Art, and that's where I wanted to go. And every day for 2 years, I walked past there and said, I have to get into the school. And I got a job at Temple University. I worked for the Center for Community Studies there. And it's amazing, because it was a place that trained VISTA volunteers. And I had an opportunity to work with a woman by the name of Linda Clark, who was the most fascinating woman I've ever met in terms of the politics of community building. And so I think about I grew up with women building communities, and I spent a lot of time in West Virginia with them. And I picked up a camera, and I decided to start photographing, and I wanted to develop a portfolio. I spent a year working there, and then decided to go to New York and build a portfolio so I could apply to Moore and the university, and well, PCA at the time. And I got there, I was accepted, both schools, but PCA gave a better scholarship. Right. And so that opportunity transformed my life. But entering into the classroom, I transferred most of my liberal arts credits and was able to just to focus for the first year on my photography, which was great. And one of the teachers said to me, well, you're taking up a good man's space. And to have that experience as a young woman with 18 other men in the room and only 3 women in the classroom, and besides myself. So the 3 of us worked together, and I was sitting there listening to a man who I thought I could respect tell me that I was taking up a good man's space. A good man could have been here because all you're going to do is get married and have a baby, and a good man could have been in this space. So what I realized that he was silencing me, my vision, silenced me as a woman in terms of my desires to be a photographer, but also to be a mother. Right. So there was a sense of a shame. I felt the sense of shame that he was throwing at me about being a woman, and I would never get a job. And so I decided, okay, I've spent too many years trying to make this happen. I'm going to just ignore him and continue to make photographs. Yeah. So I spent my 3 years there, graduated, had a really great relationships with other professors who supported my work, and kept going and had a kid.
Had it all, right. In other words.
Yes, yes.
And that I think is critically important, because we think about creative voice. And we have been recently, I would say in the last 10 to 15 years, and particularly kind of riding the wave of the phenomenon that is Ava DuVernay, seen so many women's voices and visions emerge in the creative space. But for the most part, it's been celebrated in moving picture. The art and skill of still photography is something that I think sometimes people struggle to define their relationship with. It's so prevalent around us. We're walking around with these high definition cameras on our hips that we also make calls from and do all these other functions with. And at the same time, appreciating the moments captured in imagery, which is, lock, stock, and trade of what you share with the world, is something that I don't think we give enough props to. And so I wonder, as you faced that and had to define your creative voice and how you wanted to interact with your camera and share images with the world, and now watching the evolution of technology as well, what inner dialogue you have about maintaining the vision and the voice that you've established for yourself.
I really believe in the image. I believe that image tells multiple stories. But I thought it was really significant for me to stay focused on still photography. That there are a number of photographers working. They're telling their stories. Some people are writers. Some people are visual thinkers. But I thought it was really important to live within the community of artists and photojournalists. And moving, when I was in school at PCA, I had Ann Tucker as a teacher, and she said, why not do a research paper? Because I said, where are the black photographers in the history books? She said, why not do a paper? And it ended up being like a 10-year project after graduating from PCA and going to grad school, that I worked at the Schomburg Center. And then you could see how important photography was to the larger black community. Yeah. That black photographers were working in the 1800s, documenting their communities. And I felt it was really important that their stories needed to be told. The stories not necessarily only of stoop labor that we are known for in terms of working in cotton fields, working in vegetation. It's real. We did that. But we also built communities. Yes. And I wanted to have the larger community show and see this in that experience. I had a wonderful friend who became, I called him my angel. His name is Dick Newman, and he worked for a press and asked me how would I like to do a book on Black photographers. And I'm just out of grad school. I had a research paper from an undergraduate paper, and he says, well, send it to me, let me look at it. And as a result of that, he gave me the encouragement to share all of the photographers that I have researched. Then I met photographers. I wrote to Gordon Parks in 1972, and he responded to my letter. And you think about 72, he just did, Shaft.
Yeah.
He did, the Learning Tree, and, he did so many things. And Gordon Parks is going to respond to Dear Debbie, and he responded by saying, just come and visit me. And he did, and I did. Monita Sleet did the same thing. Morgan and Marvin Smith, the Scurlock Studios, Bobby Scurlock and George Scurlock. So these were men, and some of the women that I met said, come and meet me. I really wish I met you years earlier because I threw away my negatives. No one cared about photography, and to see that you're caring about my images means a lot. So I was able to collect a lot of photography at Schomburg, and then decided to do exhibitions. So at the same time, I was still making photographs, but not necessarily caring the way that I wanted to care for my vision. But I wanted to make sure that everyone else knew about the other photographers. And so I created, work about, the politics and protests of communities, and then also of family building, about Masons and community life within that. And so that's why I really believe that photography was central. We also created, with Carrie Mae Weems, women photographers groups, and created exhibitions to make sure that women photographers' voices were known.
Yes.
The Black Photographers Annual was out, and Joe Crawford was also a mentor of mine, and he had made an impact on me in many ways.
Yeah. I mean, I know that there were other kind of gasps and drop jaws the same way that I did when you mentioned this idea of throwing out negatives. Thankfully, the technology now allows us different means of storage in order to keep it. But what is the reality? Last week in my conversation with Dr. Bloxon, I asked him, I was like, how do you begin a collection like this, now more than 800,000 pieces? But at some point, this was a physical collection that you were holding on to long before we had rent-a-storage bins and this kind of thing. The reality of that, having to make decisions based on life conditions and what have you, of negatives and storage, and how you preserve your own work from those early years. How much of a challenge was that for you?
For me to convince photographers to save them, it was a challenge. But also family members challenged me, because a lot of male photographers I knew said that their wives and children felt that their photography was like their mistress. So some daughters are still mad at me because I spent time with their fathers, who convinced them that their voices were valid. And so I convinced them to give their photographs to the Schomburg, or sell their photographs to the Schomburg or to the Smithsonian. And then also with mine, I'm just, storing it at my mother's, storing it, I just can't let go. We were just talking, Steve and I, he's scanning images, he's just in the 80s. I'm still trying to compile all of the images from that time period, because they're really important. You mentioned Adunde, and I was like, I have photographs from that period that I need to build up and share those images.
I mean, the reality of storage, I think, is something that a lot of folks grapple with, and it disturbs me because we keep having this conversation in various media forms. And one of the there was an article in I think it was Hollywood Reporter, doesn't matter. But there was an article about the fact that because digital downloads are now declining so rapidly in sales, and people have been conditioned towards streaming services. So we are probably rapidly approaching the moment, and who thought about it? We talk about the demise of record stores and this switch to MP3s or other digital formats, that was the new way that people were buying music. Well, we're not even doing that anymore. And so we're rapidly approaching the time where there are going to be services like iTunes that is seriously considering giving up digital downloads so that all we will have is the stream. And the question that I constantly kind of struggle with for all creators is this idea of storage and preservation, because everything's not going to be available on the latest streaming service. And if your Wi-Fi goes out or whatever your situation may be, the physicality of books and CDs, or at least having access to these materials, is going to become a real challenge over the next, say, 10 to 20 years.
I'm hopeful because I'm about the object still, and I think the object of the photograph is central for many of us in terms of many stories. There was a call I received earlier this week from a young woman, or I'm not sure her age, but a woman whose grandmother was Vera Jackson, and she was a photographer for the LA Sentinel in the 30s and 40s. And they and her grandmother died in the 70s. And they were cleaning out a basement, and they found all of her negatives, photographs, and another story is developed about a woman who was one of the first journalists, Black women journalists in LA. And so she's asking what to do with these images, and first, I want to meet her and hold on to them, but we need to. We need to kind of look at these histories. There are a number of exhibitions that are developed out as a result of this new archive that we're developing. The image of fashion is important as we think about stories about fashion. And here are the people who are finding in their archives new ways of looking at how fashion is a part of community, looks at beauty. It looks also at the work of men and women who are transforming their own identities and as designers and as models.
Yes.
So we begin to see different stories develop as a result of these archives. And I think it's important to consider these objects as central. The photograph as an object is central.
Indeed. And as you talk about preserving these histories and the object, one of your most recent publications, of course, celebrates the imagery of emancipation. And again, as we talk about this centrality of available history, but the selectivity of what we share, either in the classroom or in our personal conversations, your book becomes that much more of a necessary resource for our community to have a different visual of the dignity of these people who, through legislation were freed, and what kind of lives they lived in the Reconstruction era and what have you. So for the benefit of people who haven't had a chance to see the book or understand the objective, please share with us why it was important to resurrect and publish that history.
So the book is called Envision Emancipation, and how do we visualize freedom? What does freedom look like? This is a central way that Barbara and I began to think about the photograph. I also can go back to a book I read, Hattie McDaniel's biography. In her biography, she had her father's photograph, who was a Civil War soldier. And, how many people knew that they were Black Civil War soldiers? Okay? See, I didn't know when I was in school. I found out, when way into my adulthood, that Black people fought for their freedom.
On both sides.
Yes. Yes. And so it was important for us to think about, there's like 10 people raised their hand here. I have students today who said that they had no idea that Black people fought for their freedom. And so it was important for us to use photography, quote, as evidence of this, that the Black soldiers visited photographer studios before they entered the war. As soon as they received their uniforms, that they went into the studio, they photographed, they posed, they sent messages through that visual experience of looking into the camera about bravery and manhood and about freedom. And we wanted to look at the photograph, find stories about the experience, but also how photographs were used to prove that they were soldiers, that Hattie McDaniel sent letters to the pension records so that her father could get to get his pension. She wrote 10 times, and it was denied each time. When he fought in Tennessee, he talked about the injury, and the injury caused to his ear, to his limbs, but they said, oh, that didn't happen. And then someone else had to write another letter. So the mechanism to create the barriers for Black soldiers, even though they fought, that they still had to prove that they were soldiers because sometimes the records were lost. The photograph was shown with the uniform, and then fortunately that because they were mustered out and they had to sign, that's in the National Archives. And the fact that the National Archives has records, even though they don't promote that they have the records, that they're there, and so that's the evidence. That's why I think that the stories about freedom and emancipation and protests is central. I'm working on another book now. It's called The Black Civil War Soldier: Conflict and Citizenship. And so I'm reading about, there were 9 Black surgeons during the Civil War. Had no idea. They studied medicine in Canada, and they wrote to President Lincoln requesting to take care of Black soldiers, to work on the camps, and the experiences that they had. They had to fight other medical doctors who did not want Black soldiers, Black surgeons in the same room with them. There's so many stories that we find from that experience, and I'm thinking of this story. There's so many stories. I'm thinking of letters that I'm reading about, that they've written about their experience. We were told that Black people couldn't read or write.
Right.
These Black men had diaries, that women who were nurses, women from Philadelphia like Charlotte Fortin, went to South Carolina to teach freed children, and also taught soldiers, had citizenship classes with them, taught them how to write, and things like that. So there's multiple stories that are developed as a result of the experience of the archive is essential.
Yeah, one of the things that stood out from what you just offered us is this idea of photographs as evidence, which I think is a really, really powerful statement, and in a fairly painful way, because in this digital era, now we have an overabundance of evidence of discriminatory treatment, and the situations that very often lead to death in the Black community, and yet being able to evidence justice with these materials at our fingertips is still so difficult to get our brains around. And I wonder the challenge as you consider new projects and share these images and the stories behind them with the world is how your process for deciding what the next big project is, and how you kind of immerse yourself in the subject matter in order to tell the story that you want to tell, when every day we are surrounded by these moments where the incident and the image become so central to our daily lives?
Yeah, I think it's, just the experience of post Obama trauma, to the experience of looking at the news, what we felt when we had the sense of, like hope. Oh, people say, oh, that's kind of a corny word. It's not really serious. I mean, but the idea of hope is still central for me. Mm-hmm. And so I'm always looking for the story to continue to expand about humanity. And so my interest is, like Kelly Jones curated a show about just about witness. What does it mean to be a witness? Yeah. And then how do you reflect on the experiences of injustice as artists? And so as an artist, I wanted to still want to create. I still want to create and document, but also I want to uncover the past where people have written about their own experiences. So if we can continue to share the stories, to reflect on the stories as an art form, in writing, in photography, in painting, and building these images up, I want to continue that. And there's too many stories that are ignored today.
Yeah. You serve as the chair of photography and imagery for NYU. And in an era where the collegiate generation now is used to getting almost everything for free, mm-hmm. And in this era of rapid information exchange and what have you, what challenge do you face in trying to shape curriculum and to help young people envision what their career possibilities are when trying to get valued for this work mm-hmm. is becoming increasingly difficult in this digital era?
Yeah, it's difficult. Many of us who teach, it's not only the students believe it, the parents are the problem. How do you, what am I pay $60,000 a year for, my kid to be a photographer? And what's going to happen? Where are the job possibilities? But we have over 300 students every year who apply, and we can only accept 32. Mm-hmm. We have a summer high school program. In the summer high school program, the students are really passionate about their stories. They want to make photographs. They believe that they're going to add to the discussion about images. And there are many of the students who are first generation, and most first generations don't have the support of family members right. who want them to be artists, but they believe that as first generations, that students, that they want to tell their stories about what it means to grow up in this country. And so it's a fascinating time for me, and I continue to tell them about the idea of hope, that we are in the boardroom of advertising. Someone needs to be there to make that different voice, tell a different story about that experience. We know that a number of people I know who are in journalism, that photo editors are losing their jobs because the writers are becoming the photo editors yes. from that experience. So we are constantly trying to fight that battle. I was on, I visited a talk at New York Times recently, and the Nicole Hannah-Jones, do you know her? Mm-hmm. Does anyone know her name, Nicole Hannah-Jones? Google her. She's an amazing speaker. She gave a talk. At the end of her talk, she put an image up, and the image was, she's a journalist for the New York Times. She said, I want you to think about white death when you look at this image. She said there was an image of of African migrants entering Europe. The image was this beautiful image that, and I could see a young woman, her breast exposed, a young man, his chest exposed. He had yellow shorts on, and the woman had on this beautiful color, and it was a sunny day, looks like right after rain. And then I saw there were stacked bodies on the boat. So I'm thinking this is a beautiful photograph. And then I'm horrified that there were bodies on top of each other. So these were dead people. And so she said, "Now, how can the New York Times put this on the cover? Why is Black death so disposable? Why is Black death acceptable for the cover of the New York Times? And when there were kids who were killed that same week in Florida, and 17 children, and they said, can you imagine white death on the cover of the New York Times, on the front page of the New York Times? If they showed the deaths of those white children, maybe someone would stop gun control. Maybe we need to see this so that they could stop selling guns." And so we were left, and that image still haunts me, and the idea still haunts me. And then I thought about it, and then I asked her, well, so what happened? Didn't someone challenge the person who put this on the cover, on the front page of the New York Times? And she says she didn't know. She didn't work on that in that area. So I turned around and looked. There were all the editors in the back. And so there was an editor from the Washington Post who said that we sit around and we talk about images, we talk about the difficult images, and we share these multiple stories about it, and we listen. And someone else said, oh, and then there's this little lady way in the back, and she says, I did it. You know, and I feel that some images just need to be seen. And I said, oh my goodness. You know, I said, but didn't anyone challenge you about this image? That this image would, you know, these are unidentified people, but we can see that the young woman was definitely still breastfeeding when she died. She, you know, where was her baby? And there were so many stories. She says, no one challenged me, I did it. And so there was complete silence. So I'm looking around, asking someone else, well, in my face, well, how do you all feel about this? And no one said anything. And then after, of course, people, oh, I'm so glad you said that. You know, I'm so glad you said that. You know, well, I said, well, why didn't you say something? You know, why didn't you say something? Because I think that we all need to say something if there's a problem about an image that we are uncomfortable with. Yeah. And I do it in the classroom. My students will challenge me about an image, and so there has to be a dialogue, and I think that that's central to it.
Yeah, and in, you know, kind of sticking with the theme of what's happening in modern day or in this moment of our history, there's also a struggle between representation in all of these spaces, like you've just mentioned, and a hesitation for people to claim all of their adjectives, if you will, because there has been a rising wave of, by identifying in particular ways, other people might see it as alienating. Mm-hmm. So to stand firm in cisgender identity as a woman, and this is some of what you want to convey in your pictures, might be alienating to members of the LGBTQ community. If you claim to be a Black artist or a Black photographer, that people might feel that they're not welcome to view these images or to comment on these images because of various reasons. How are your students and how are you feeling about claiming your adjectives in this moment?
Well, it's difficult. You know, I feel that we're able to talk, and that exchange is what we need. We have open critiques, we have difficult conversations. I'm always asking my students to be sensitive to the voices of others that are different, and some are having different other experiences in other classes. That and I don't, quote, see any room as a safe space, but just the idea of thinking about an idea to have an opportunity to speak. So I talk about the idea of, quote, of a safe space as my class is, but I also allow them to think about, we can have a difficult discussion. We can talk about get out and what does get out mean, you know. We can talk about images that are harmful, and then let's write about them if you don't want to talk about it in public. But there's a lot of denial in being open about the images, and so I think that it's constantly working through it for graduate students and undergraduate students. But I think the fact that we can continue to talk is the most helpful and safe space for me to continue that dialogue.
You know, I want to give folks in the audience an opportunity to ask questions as well. So one of the final questions I'll offer is the idea of beauty. That very often photography challenges the notion of stereotypes, and some people might say in some ways contributes to it. The things that we normalize, the things that we elevate in culture can sometimes be very challenging. What might you offer the photographers, whether they're hobbyists or professionals in our audience, about that sort of inner critique process and thinking about the conversation that is created from the images that they're sharing?
Well, you know, we all create different types of images that we want to share, like from landscape. So my new project is photographing closets.
Yes.
And I'm enjoying the idea of photographing someone's closet because there are so many identities that are formed in the closet. That we know who we are when we decide to wear a t-shirt or wear, you know, gold today. What am I saying about myself today? You know, if you're wearing all black. But I think, and it's a new project, it's about also the archive of personalities that we are hiding sometimes or we are promoting sometimes. But I believe that coming through different types of projects that I'm exploring, and it's always about this in pursuit of beauty. And my idea of beauty is about peace. And so I want to have the idea of not, quote, pretty, you know, in the Webster, Merriam-Webster, but the idea of peace and beauty is a central way of how to live today. And that's something I'm exploring through my photography.
Indeed. Well, I'm sad that we weren't able to get you to cross paths with my late grandmother before she passed, because there's a statement, one of the reasons why I felt so drawn to this new project with the closets is that my grandmother would go shopping every time one of the grandkids or children put her in a very bad emotional space. But she refused to wear it. So after she passed, one of the things that fascinated us about cleaning out her house was to look in this closet of clothes that she bought and would never wear on purpose because of the energy that was associated with acquiring those clothes. But what she went out and got, you know, mad at Stephanie, what yielded from that and why, you know, just, you know, kind of putting some guesses around that. But this has been delightful. I'm going to shut up and we're going to open up the floor for those of you who may have questions. And Sydney has a microphone for those of you who would like to ask anything. So please raise your hand and she'll come to you.
Is that Kelly, do you have your phone? Okay, that's okay.
Pardon me, I have a kind of a two-part question.
If you could speak a little closer.
And you should also say your name.
Okay. My name is Hinda Schumann. Is that loud enough?
Yes, you're fine.
Okay. The two-part question goes to part of the discussion on archiving work and the importance of maintaining these archives. One of the things that I'm interested in is who has access and how they're stored and managed. One of the things that has kind of frightened me of late is how a certain element, people will look at a photograph and see two entirely different things. So for example, the amount of people at the most recent presidential inauguration. Some people say there were a lot of people, and some people say there weren't a lot of people. But they're looking at the same photograph. And so a question about how one can deal with that in an archive and make that kind of thing clear. The other half of the question has to do with your role as an educator. And when a student, the students are hopeful and excited and interested in telling their story, which will eventually perhaps be part of an archive. If a student wants to tell the story of another culture or another location, how do you advise that student?
It really surprises me when students, most of them believe that they have access. They believe that they are telling, if they have in terms of their heartfelt stories about a community that they want to document or someone they want to follow with true respect and curiosity at the same time, that it's encouraged. And then there are some people who believe that, oh no, that certain people shouldn't photograph in communities. So there's a friend of mine who's photographing in trans communities now. He's a straight man. He's photographing in trans communities. And it's not as a spectacle, but in terms of how do we tell a different story through a lens of a straight man. And what he was, it took him a while to be accepted. Once he was accepted, he understood that, he understood the stories that needed to be told and how comfortable many of the trans people performing for the camera as well as behind the camera in terms of the back room of private spaces. And so there's these opportunities are open, and I believe that people could enter into, if they believe in the project and it's not necessarily predatory in any way, that they are really making a difference and adding to the discussion of difference. When we think about documenting migration, it's a difficult story from a mother's point of view, from a father's point of view. But some of these young people who aren't parents, they are moved by what they see in the news, and they want to document it. So I think it's important if your heart is in the right space, and if you want to tell a horrific story, if you're thinking differently, I really talk to them about really what are you adding to this discussion. And then sometimes they're in the classroom and the students are having their own battles where they think that one gay student told another student, well, I don't think you should be photographing, in my community. And so who owns the community? Who owns the voice? And so there's a battle that can happen. But then, there's a way of trying to keep the conversation going. And that's what I try to do.
Other questions?
Oh, great. Okay.
Hi, Stephen Perloff. Well, as someone who's been an archivist, and you've talked about how everyone has a camera on them, and there are billions and billions of images, but almost none of them are printed. And you know, probably in a decade they will be inaccessible. So, you know, how do we know what to save or facilitate saving images that really matter?
Mm-hmm. I think that it needs to matter to you, and that's how I'm trying to save mine now. You know, one of the things about Gordon Parks, if you look at the Gordon Parks Foundation website, you'll see that he has images that I had no idea that he photographed in some places. He's circled one image on a page, or the editor circled one image on a page to print or to publish. And now the foundation is finding images right next to that image that we all know, that's stronger to me, you know. And so I'm really thinking that I don't believe we should edit ourselves. I think we should have an opportunity to have the contact sheet available. I still believe in that range, because Gordon is true evidence of what could happen if he threw out his negatives. You know, I curated a show with Gordon and Philip Brookman in the 90s, really in the 1990s, 20s, early 2000s, and I didn't even know he had these color photographs of photographing in the South. I mean, and they were in the bottom of the drawer. Oh, Debbie, don't worry about those images there. And now I'm seeing the images that Maurice Berger, he just did an article about them, and so there's so many images, and I know it's hard to edit, but I think that just edit what you like, print what you like, and save for the future archivists to say, look what Stephen missed.
Yeah. or developing a passion for an image that you might have been lukewarm about, but it speaks to someone in a completely different way. And I just want to jump in to say that the images that you see as a part of this exhibit, Photographic Memory, are technically outtakes. These are the images that my uncle gave to my aunt. Just as an example of things that he liked, that images that spoke to him, that were not necessarily the provenance of Johnson Publications or the official published photographs that were released from the White House. These were just the ones he liked, and that he wanted to share with her. Had he not done that, then they would not have been collected and at the later part of her life passed down to me as kind of the family historian and archivist in many different ways. And so one of the messages that I've been striving to leave with audiences as we've been gathering around this installation is, for anyone, it doesn't make a difference what age you are, because all kinds of things happen to everybody. Think about the kind of digital rights and the estate planning, if you will, of the things that you hold dear, and hopefully images are among that. When you think about, for Black families, a lot of our histories first started in the family Bible, with people documenting them there, and that long before we got into birth certificates and other official governmental forms of noting people's existence. It was about noting those names and birth dates in the family Bible. So if you happen to be the bearer of documentation like that for your family, if you are a photographer or a vocalist or whatever it is that you do creatively, and you want to see that work continue to be available to someone, then you got to think about how you're preserving it and redundancy. And this is a big deal. These images that you see in front of you were not printed from the negative, unfortunately, because I never had the negatives. I had the prints. And thankfully, I had a moment where I was able to scan them all, because we had a mold mildew disaster in the house, and all of the original prints were lost. So these digital images that you're seeing on the wall now were only available because of a series of fortunate events, not like Lemony Snicket. And so I want everyone to think about that. If you have that one family album that has all of those treasured photographs, please take some time, you, siblings, cousins, whoever you need to enlist to be part of that, digitize those images and then put them on multiple hard drives or DVDs and share them with other people in your family, so that if anyone has an act of God happen to the house or to the images themselves, somebody has it and somebody can continue to share that. It's incredibly important.
Hey, thanks for being a part of this. I was intrigued as you were speaking of Gordon Parks. I mean, we all know him to be a genius, a Renaissance man, and documented so much of Black culture and world culture. What are your thoughts? What resonates to you about his body of work? And then, are there any things that you'd be critical of in terms of his approach or whatever? Because I feel like having access, having Life magazine finance him is what helps us have so many great images. But, you know, what are your thoughts on Gordon Parks?
He was my mentor. So he encouraged me prior to even meeting him that I had a vision and a voice. The Portrait Gallery is organizing an exhibition of his works, the first 10 years of his life. And the idea that people think that there are no more photographs to look at, they're all the same. But Philip Brookman has found a whole new body of work of Gordon's first 10 years. I was really excited to have that opportunity to look at the work, to look at the photographs that he focused on fashion. Mm-hmm. There were Black fashion models in Chicago in the late 1930s, and he documented Black life in Chicago. That was people who were upper middle class, people who just migrated from the South, that they had hopes and dreams to add to American society in a broad way, and he documented it. Gordon, he really believed, and he says that life was a banquet, and he wanted to be at that table, and I really respect that. So I don't see any critique of his work that is, you know, I think that he was prepared. He was prepared. He saved everything. He has his mother's photograph from, you know, early turn of the 19th, 20th century. So the fact that he understood beauty by looking at his mother's images from that time period. He had a difficult life after her death, basically as a young man, moving forward into a life without a mother and with an older father. But Gordon saved all of his letters. He understood the archive. He gave it to Wichita. So all of his letters and magazines and things that I didn't even know existed were there. He was a photo editor for a magazine called Smart Woman magazine. And, you know, a magazine, Smart Woman magazine in the 1940s, 30s. You know, so just thinking about language.
Yeah.
You know, he understood language and what it meant to create documents from that experience. So we have the Gordon Parks Foundation. When he passed away, he was prepared for, you know, for his legacy. And so now there's the Gordon Parks Foundation. They have an annual event where they offer scholarships to college students. They give 3 to NYU students, you know, 3 to Pratt and Purchase. So it's a legacy that he really believed that could continue.
Hi.
Hi.
My name's Sam Ewing. Just wanted to echo the thanks that have already been expressed, both for the conversation, but for the wonderful set of images we get to look at here. I love hearing your thoughts about preservation and archives and the kind of sites where these kinds of images can live and last. But I feel like the other side of that is sort of how these images move about and where we experience them. So I guess I just wanted to ask, how do you think about the means of distribution of your own work and the spaces of reception, and just in your own work or in your teaching?
Well, I think, thank you for your question. It's important to think about, like, Aperture Magazine is an important venue today, that they have decided to, and one of the editors is a former student. I'm really excited that Brendan is there. He understands what it means to have an archive of younger photographers that they're supporting in terms of publications, but also he's looking globally. So there's a whole new genre of African photography that we're unaware of. I was unaware of. I went to South Africa last year and met, I guess maybe about 20 photographers. You know, there's a marketplace there that place for young photographers and older photographers. So when we think about the archive expanding now, the archive is expanding through publications, but through exhibitions, and then through Instagram. And we can see there's a body of work that's, you know, we're seeing through the lens of everyday people who are documenting their daily work or their communities, their friends and their family. And so the archive is not static anymore, that it's also kind of evolving and revolving around stories that are, as you mentioned the word mundane, but the everyday of what people are thinking about. And one of the aspects that I'm seeing with a lot of young people is fashion. Fashion has a voice that has a new language today. People who are, you know, tats, you know, using the language of ink. That's another way of creating new identities for them. And it's a sense of pride, and they understand that in a way that they are preserving that history. So I think that's part of it. And with my interest in going back to think of how do we continue to support photography, it's through, you know, I'm introduced to this space, and I'm really loving the mission. And I think that we can continue to build them in different spaces. And my son has an exhibition now at Delaware, but he's also looking at the archive, and he's using a new process that he's using the idea that the image has been hidden in the archive, and only that we can see it, we need to shine light on it. So he uses a cell phone technique where you have to flash photography to see what's in the hidden part of the image. So I don't know, what's the name of do you know what the process is that he's using?
He's using a printmaking process that reverses the image, right, and then makes it positive again.
Right.
It's hidden there's an optical illusion. It's hidden in the optics, right, until the light shines on it.
Yeah, so that's kind of like this metaphor of how do we consider ways of shining light on the past. But I hope you'll get a chance to see that exhibition.
And for the benefit of people in the back of the room who may not have heard that, it said the printmaking process reverses the image and then makes it positive again, so that as your flash hits it, it reveals the image in the actual print. So I'm very curious to hear more about that. Yeah.
So his name is Hank Willis Thomas, if you get a chance to
Yes.
see his work. Okay.
Well, you know.
And just to say, Larry Saltzman's here.
Yes.
We met through through photography of over time, but also he honored me today with a gift of a book I wrote a reference, or I was on a panel for the Pew, and for 17 years he's been holding this book to give to me. That.
And I always say that her encouragement probably got me that award because I had applied 5 times for it. Probably it was the year that she was a
You know, it's funny that sometimes that you can, you know, any of you, if you're ever on a panel, just, you know, you have to be passionate about the folks, because sometimes you're fighting someone you don't even know. And you really believe in the work, and you have to negotiate, and so. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Stephanie.
Indeed.
Yes.
Well, as we wrap up, there are a few things. If you have been moved, if your curiosity has been raised about anything that you've heard tonight, I want to make sure that you know the website for this space, for this foundation, is Slought, SLOUGHT.org. Find out more information about other upcoming exhibitions and events that are held in this space. For Soul Sanctuary, our website is soul-sanctuary.net. So you are invited to come check out our podcast and find out about other gatherings that we'll be having in the upcoming future. I want to thank Mike Dennis of Real Black, who's been shooting tonight's event and who is responsible for the reel that plays here in what we like to call the immersion studio. And his website is REELBLACK.com. Find out about his screening series and ways that you can support the work that he's been doing with his video camera, archiving some of these wonderful cultural moments here in Philadelphia and all across the nation. And, you know, make a friend. Don't leave here tonight without saying hi to somebody you've never seen before. The importance of this is cultural community. I feel like I've made a great new friend in Aaron Levy, who is responsible for Slought, and we look forward to doing more events here in this space. My interaction with the venerable Dr. Deb Willis has been because of relationships and friendships, and Philadelphia needs to, if we call ourselves the city of brotherly love and sisterly affection, as I said on my show earlier today, we need to act like it. And so build these wonderful relationships, and let's make community really mean something in this city and be a beacon for the rest of the world. And if you haven't had a chance to see the exhibit, then I hope before you leave tonight, you'll take a moment just to glance at some of the photos and engage in that conversation as well. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you.
You.